next 20 minutes of various people explaining the connection between the Church of the SubGenius and Robert Anton Wilson, the great writer. This is part of a tribute show about Wilson from the British show called Right Where You Are Sitting Now.
Rob Anton Wilson show, really. But
you've never mentioned Wilson before, Ken?
We've mentioned him in pretty much every episode, actually, but we've never actually never actually done a proper, episode, as it were, about him. So it just seems a bit wrong not to have done that. But anyway, we got there eventually. Almost a year later. But so what was it that? How did you first find out about Robert Anton Wilson, Jay?
In fact, I first heard about Robert Anton Wilson. I may have told this story in a few episodes of Out There Radio, but I picked up a Church of the SubGenius book called High Weirdness by Mail.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that. That's good.
Yeah, it's a great book, and I think I was maybe 16 or 17 when I picked it up. I was in high school, and it was one of those books that I, immediately devoured and then showed my friends. And I was like, oh, have you seen this? Like, look at this crazy stuff you can get. Like, it's, it's all, and this is, of course, pre World Wide Web. And there was just all kinds of information in this book about just crazy organizations, crazy authors, and in fact, I credit that particular book with turning me on to a lot of different things, including Robert Anton Wilson's book, The Illuminatus Trilogy. And so, by the time I decided to start, looking around for, I guess, branching out from the SubGenius book and started to find other authors that had mentioned, I was in college at the time, and it turns out that the college I went to had a pretty good library, and in fact had not only the Illuminatus trilogy in its collection, but also several other books that were mentioned in the SubGenius book. So I started, I guess, becoming a regular at the university library and checking out a lot of these things, and that's where I first picked up the Illuminatus trilogy. And I actually, I hate to say this. Actually, I don't hate to say it. I've only read the first two books of the Illuminatus trilogy. In fact, the other Wilson books, his nonfiction, I found to be a lot more interesting to me personally than his fiction. Although his fiction is, of course, a lot of fun and has a lot of other great qualities. His nonfiction was what really got me. In particular, his books Prometheus Rising and Cosmic Trigger, and some others. Yeah, that's how I started reading Wilson.
Yeah, actually, I was given again. The first one I read was the Illuminatus trilogy as well. I'd heard about it before. I think it again might have been from SubGenius, actually, on the SubGenius, the very, very early SubGenius website. It was one of the first sites on the web, from what I remember. It was hosted on the university server. I always remember it, and it kept referring back to Wilson. And there was a group as well. I think it was called alt.wilson. It's one of those old Usenet groups, and I used to keep seeing it, wondering what the hell they were talking about. And actually, eventually, a friend of mine lent it to me. I remember I got about halfway through, and it's one of those books where it's kind of. We'll talk to Are You Serious about this a bit later as well, but there's this kind of insane amount of information thrown at you, and it's completely non-linear, so it's kind of hard to explain to anyone that hasn't actually read it, I suppose. But there's no kind of linear passage throughout the book. It kind of cuts back and forwards through time and space, and it just throws billions and billions of conspiracy theories at you, and you can never quite tell if they're kind of based on fact or... I just remember it completely and utterly did my head in. So I only got about halfway through the book and had to stop for about 3 months. Then I had to pick up the rest of it and finish it afterwards. So
it's like having a countercultural Wikipedia in a non-linear narrative fictional form.
Yeah.
The Kennedy assassination. I've never been satisfied with the Warren Commission.
Now, the next guy we're bringing on the show is someone that has been on since the early days of the this show. He's also quite interested in turning people into religious reverence, I suppose. And he was also heavily influenced by Wilson and Discordianism generally. This is Reverend Ivan Stang, one of our favourite guests.
I'm one of those people who stumbled upon the Illuminatus book first when it was in cheap paperback form. In fact, I found it in a supermarket. in the probably around 1976 or 77. I forget when it came out, but it had a yellow submarine and an eye and a pyramid on it. I thought, well, that looks weird. I'll try this, and it was fantastically weird. I thought, oh my God, this is. I guess I'm not the only one who's completely crazy. It was really inspiring. And if I had said many, many times that if it hadn't been for Wilson and Shea's Illuminatus, there might be a church of the SubGenius, but we wouldn't get it. And it probably wouldn't be funny. It would be all the wrong sort of thing. But when we finally put together the very first SubGenius pamphlet, I was desperate to send it to my heroes, which was underground comic book artists and people like Shea and Wilson, especially Shea and Wilson. And Paul Mavrides gave me Wilson's address. I think he was, I can't even remember if he was in Ireland then or not. But I came up with a bullshit excuse for why I was contacting him, because at the time I didn't understand that. I mean, I wasn't a published author then, and I thought, published authors don't want to hear from fans, and they're rich and famous and standoffish. And I later learned that that's only true of the 3 or 4 a year, who are chosen to be the bestsellers, Stephen King types and so forth. But I wrote to Wilson asking him a question about a UFO group that he had mentioned in his in Illuminatus or somewhere, the Silver Shirts, because they were in Texas. And I thought, I'm in Texas, so that'll be a good connection. And much to my tremendous surprise, he wrote back a friendly letter telling me what he knew about this obscure little group. And he said, if you get any further into UFOs, try to keep your sense of humor. And that was my end. I said, I'll prove to him I kept my sense of humor, and I sent him the SubGenius pamphlet, and much to my surprise, he absolutely loved it, and kind of gave us a pat on the back, and when we got our book deal, he gave me a nice quote to go on the back of the book. So he was always very friendly to us and remained extremely friendly towards Church of the SubGenius to the end. I think the last time we saw him in person was at Winter Star a couple of years before he died, and a friend of mine was helping him around in his wheelchair and so forth. But he was in great spirits even then. He was really cheerful and very, very funny. He always struck me as being a really funny person. I would get asked to open for him when he'd speak in Dallas or Austin back when I lived in Texas, and that's how I would ended up having a few meals with him and got to tell him how much I admired him. But one of my very favorite memories was back when Robert Shea was still alive. The folks who run Winter Star and Starwood, ACE, or the Association for Consciousness Exploration in Cleveland, brought Shea and Wilson both in. And I had the most wonderful evening just sitting around listening to those two guys talk about movies. They were both really big movie fans with encyclopedic knowledge of the whole history of movies. And it wasn't what I expected. I kind of expected these guys to be talking about something sort of heavier or lighter or something, but it was just movies. And it was really a delightful conversation to sit in on.
Yeah, I actually checked out a movie that he recommended to me, well, not directly to me, but recommended in an interview called F for Fake. I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
Yes, yeah. He I've heard him mention that one. In fact, I think he talked about it at one of the Winter Stars, because it had just recently sort of been re-released.
Yeah, excellent.
I mentioned to him the movie The Trial, which was an Orson Welles film.
Oh, it's a Kafka. Yeah.
Kafka, yeah. And he jumped up and down and said, "That's my favorite movie."
Excellent.
So it seemed we had at least some sort of similar taste in movies. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's really amazing. It's hard to find.
Yeah, they remade it as well, didn't they? Which I prefer the original though. But
I don't know. The only one I saw had Anthony Perkins as the protagonist and was stark black and white.
yeah.
I later learned it was shot in France.
Ah.
But and then the other thing that happened that particular Winter Star, I think Robert Shea met the woman he married.
Ah.
He may have been married before. I mean, these guys were in their 40s or 50s at this point, maybe even older. But there was a lady speaking at Winter Star, and she and Shea met, and the next thing we knew, they'd gotten married.
Ah.
And then Shea died, which was just awful. I mean, it was really sudden, and I felt so sorry for his brand new wife.
Yeah, and he was actually quite a good writer in his own right, wasn't he? I mean,
Well, I've never read any of his solo novels, I'm sorry to say.
Ah.
And I haven't read everything Robert Anton Wilson wrote.
No, I think it's quite hard. He wrote quite a lot of stuff, didn't he?
But yeah, that guy could write faster than I can read. So, but I one time had the experience of, this isn't something I do all the time. In fact, it's been years since I did this, but I was tripping and reading Schrodinger's Cat on an airplane.
Oh, wow.
I had already read most of the trilogy, and I was coming down to the end of it. And I was, obviously, since I was on a plane, I wasn't, and reading a book, I wasn't tripping really hard. But for some reason, it all seemed to come together. And when I got to the end of it, I was so convinced that I sort of understood what he was saying that I wrote him a long letter on the back of a vomit bag, an air sickness bag. I don't know if they even include those in planes anymore, but there was just enough room. And I mailed him the handwritten note on the bag, and he later told me he really appreciated it.
Excellent. So, I mean, talking about his work,
the thing that, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, talking about his work, what particular books of his, other than Illuminatus, did you kind of like really resonate with?
Well, I can't remember which book this is in. It's one of the collections of essays. But he wrote a very out-of-character, serious thing about the death of his daughter.
Oh, right, yeah.
Who died in a violent attack when she was 12 years old. I was, that struck me, and I told him this, that to me, out of all the things he'd written, that description of how he dealt with the tragedy of his daughter's death stuck with me more than anything else because it was so very real. And at the time, I had a 12-year-old daughter and lived in a really dangerous neighborhood. And was worried about that kind of, you couldn't let your kids walk on the streets in the daytime. This, of course, was 20 years after what had happened to his daughter. But that, I can't remember which collection it was in.
It's in Cosmic Trigger.
Yeah, I was going to say, it must have been Cosmic Trigger. It's the one that I don't have a copy of left because I've loaned it to somebody. That was just so real, So much of what he writes about is in the flighty, airy realms of mysticism and philosophy. But when he gets down and dirty, that can mean a lot too.
Yeah.
It just tore me up reading about it, but it also was kind of inspiring, the fact that he had to come to grips with all that. I'm sure he felt kind of partly responsible because he wasn't making enough money to live in a safe neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very honest, isn't it? It's a very honest depiction of what happened, I felt.
Yeah, it really pinned me.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting. I can tell you that Robert Anton Wilson was one of the hardest people to record in the world. He would not work with a microphone. You had to put that thing right up against his lips and then hope he didn't change position. Because he talked in that nice Brooklyn monotone. But he was not very mic friendly. So I always, every time he spoke, I found myself having the nerve to run up there and adjust the mic a little bit right in the middle of his thing, because he just didn't seem to want to speak up. Once when I was opening for him, I was this was in the early days, and I was kind of insecure and had a couple of drinks before I went on, which I would never do now. And I went on and screamed and yelled and hollered in this little bookstore where he was speaking. And when I got off, he walked up to the podium and said, "After the storm, then the calm." I felt kind of like an idiot. But I've always felt kind of like an idiot, so that wasn't a big of a change because of my position in the Church of the SubGenius. He was very, very friendly, considering, when I first approached him as a fan, he didn't treat me like a jerk. He gave me really good advice, and I could not possibly be that polite. Not after what I've been through.
I mean, one thing that I've been talking with the other guests about is what we think that Robert Anton Wilson's legacy will be. I mean, it's strange that he seems to have become. He seems to be as popular, if not even more popular, now that he's actually passed away. And it's a bit like, almost reminds me a bit of. I was talking to Lon Milo Duquette about this. It reminds me a bit of Aleister Crowley in the way that he suddenly became more famous and kind of more read after he died. And I was wondering, do you think that Robert Anton Wilson does have a legacy?
Oh, obviously he has a legacy, and unfortunately it goes two different ways. On the one hand, there are probably numberless people who his writing inspired to go in a really what turned out for them to be a really positive direction. On the other hand, there's people who read philosophy and mysticism and never pick up on that whole maybe thing. And so they will take figurative things literally. I think that Pope Bob has the same problem of the Church of the SubGenius, in that sometimes it only makes assholes worse. And it's not just us; it's any religion or mysticism related type thing, or philosophy, can function as something that just justifies a person's already bad behavior.
Yeah.
If they misunderstand it. And it's really easy to misunderstand somebody who's right. Half the time Wilson is being tongue-in-cheek. And it takes a lot of subtlety to pick up on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes he's very blunt and plain and speaks exactly what he means. And other times I think he's playing games. And I know he was playing games. I mean, he told me so. It was like, I've had several writers go, "Hey, now, don't take this stuff too seriously." I've had to say that. And, oh, God, sometimes it doesn't do any good. but from what I can tell from looking at the last interviews with him that were in the Maybe Logic film and so forth, it seemed to me that he kept his sense of humor to the bitter end, and that's a lesson for all of us. Really, there's that whole maybe. As he said, if only people would say maybe more often, it might solve a whole lot of problems.
Yeah, definitely.
And to me, that's kind of sums up that's what I got out of Wilson's material. I like to think that knowing him helped make me a little bit less mean and a little bit nicer and a little bit more tolerant of other people's viewpoints and a little bit less sure a lot less sure of my own opinions. Things that I thought were facts, his work helped me to realize, no, what those are opinions. And you really don't know. And so, maybe this is the way it is. and I really do. That used to be when I had a SIG on the internet. My SIG was often that quote by him.
Yeah.
Maybe if everybody said maybe more often, the world might be an easier place to live in. And I maybe that's right.
So if you get a deep intuitive understanding of the relation of something and nothing, then you're in a state of slack. And slack is even better than nirvana. Because if you're in slack, you are in the balance point between something and nothing, and then you can get something for nothing. This was revealed to J.R. Bob Dobbs, the founder of the Church of the SubGenius, by L. Ron Hubbard on an elevator in Palm Beach, Florida in 1957. J.R. Bob Dobbs was only a humble aluminum siding salesman at that time, but it just took one meeting with L. Ron Hubbard, and he learned the secret of power and how to stand on the balance between something and nothing and get something for nothing. And he founded the Church of the SubGenius, and now he's one of the richest men in the world, but he still acts like a regular fella. Of course, it's very hard to see Bob these days, because he's reached such a tremendous level of spiritual elevation that most people who've met him can't even remember the experience. It's like a UFO contact. There's total or partial amnesia, conjunctivitis and eye strain, nervous symptoms. Sometimes it requires hospitalization, and almost inevitably you're persecuted by the men in black afterwards. The men in black are agents of the conspiracy. The conspiracy is all the groups that's trying to stamp out the Church of the SubGenius. It consists of all the other religions in the world, the Rockefellers, the OPEC nations, and the people who put Hawaiian music in elevators, and all other evil and sinister forces like that. So if you've met Bob, they'll send the men in black around to persecute you. Don't be afraid. The men in black will come to your door pretending to be Jehovah's Witnesses, and they will try to get into your house. The thing to do is greet them in a friendly way and say, we're glad to see you. This is a Satanist temple. We were looking for subjects for a sacrifice, and we're glad you've arrived. This will absolutely guarantee you will never be bothered by Jehovah's Witnesses again. They send a report back to Kingdom Hall with your address on it, and nobody ever goes there again. It really works. This is not a put-on. It really works. They believe in that sort of stuff.
Yes, friends, that was Robert Anton Wilson himself, Pope Bob, preaching about J.R. Bob Dobbs and the Church of the SubGenius. That interview material was from the show Right Where You Are Sitting Now, which can be heard at sittingnow.co.uk. You're listening to the Hour of Slack from the Church of the SubGenius, which is at subgenius.com. There is an entire 8-week class about the history and practice of the Church of the SubGenius starting April 6th at maybelogic.net and maybelogic.org. And now, The Lounger.